An ordinary man decided to check his backyard with a metal detector and heard a strong signal coming from underground. He started digging, thinking he'd find some old junk, but under the soil appeared the roof of a vintage convertible. When he opened the trunk, he froze in shock. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The house was older than its paint admitted, and the porch sagged in the middle as if time itself had leaned too heavily on it. When Michael Jenkins first saw it, he didn't see the cracked window panes or the stubborn ivy clutching its wooden ribs. He saw a patch of quiet. After years of concrete noise and sleepless city nights, quiet was the only luxury he could afford. He had come to this small town on the edge of nowhere with little more than a truck full of boxes and a desire to start over, far from the ghosts that had followed him through the last decade of his life. The property had stood vacant for years. The realtor had spoken about it with that polite, rehearsed detachment that usually hides a bad story. The house, she said, had history, the kind that no one cared to explain. The yard behind it stretched deep into a slope of clay and wild grass, ending near a thicket of old maple trees. There was something about that yard that had caught Michael's eye. The stillness, maybe, or the way the afternoon light seemed thicker there, like the air was holding on to the past. He spent the first weeks mending things that would not stay mended. Pipes leaked, doors warped, floorboards moaned. He moved through each day with the slow patience of a man relearning to live alone. The evenings were the best part. He would sit on the porch with a mug of black coffee, watch the light fade behind the trees, and tell himself that the silence was healing him, even if he didn't yet believe it. The neighbors were kind enough in that distant rural way. Across the road lived an elderly widow named Mrs. Collins, who baked too often for one person and always sent him home with slices of pie wrapped in foil. She called him Mr. Jenkins, though he told her a dozen times to use his first name. To her, he was a newcomer, polite, quiet, widowed, and harmless. The rest of the town barely noticed him. He liked it that way. He had once been an electrician, back when his hands were steadier and his life still had direction. Now, he worked freelance, fixing the odd wire or replacing light fixtures for the few people who still trusted a stranger with tools. The little he earned was enough to keep the lights on and food in the fridge. What he lacked in money he made up for with solitude. It suited him. It was on a Sunday afternoon when he first saw the ad. Someone in town was selling an old metal detector for $50, claiming it was perfect for hobbyists. He had no particular reason to buy it, just curiosity, maybe boredom, but there was a spark inside him, something that wanted a distraction, a reason to dig into the earth for anything other than memory. The seller, a retired postal worker with missing teeth and too much time, showed him how to adjust the sensitivity and swing the coil slow and low over the ground. "You'd be surprised what people bury," the man said with a grin. Back home, Michael took the detector into the backyard and began to practice. The rhythmic sweep of the coil over the soil became almost meditative. It chirped occasionally at nails, bits of rusted iron, a bent spoon. Most days he found nothing of value, but he didn't mind. There was something satisfying about the beeps, the feel of dirt under his fingers, the small thrill of unearthing the forgotten. The land had character. Some parts were soft with loam, others hard-packed clay. Near the center of the yard, the ground dipped slightly, as if the earth had once been disturbed and then settled again. He noticed it, but didn't think much of it at first. The detector gave faint murmurs there sometimes, inconsistent and shallow. Probably trash from an old shed or fence post. One evening, while packing up his tools, he met Ray Patterson, the neighbor from 2 lots over. A wiry man in his 60s with grease under his fingernails and the kind of stare that suggested he'd seen too much and spoken too little. Ray was an old mechanic who had run a garage in town back in the 70s. When he learned Michael was living on that plot, he shook his head and said, "You know, they used to call this whole street Silver Row. There was a nightclub here once, Silver Lounge, I think it was called, burned down sometime before I was born. Folks say that place saw a lot of bad nights." Michael asked him what kind of bad nights, but Ray only shrugged. The kind people stop talking about once they get old enough to know better. Then he laughed softly, as if to dismiss the thought, and changed the subject to baseball. That night, lying in bed, Michael found himself thinking about the ground under his house. The notion of a nightclub buried beneath his lawn was oddly fascinating. He pictured laughter and neon, smoke curling above a piano, the shimmer of chrome and sequins, all of it gone, paved over by time and rain. It made him feel as though his life had become part of a story he didn't yet understand. Days passed. He kept digging here and there, half hoping to find a coin from that vanished era. The detector grew familiar in his hands. He could tell the difference between aluminum and iron by the pitch of its tone. He found a bottle cap one morning, stamped with the words Silver Lounge in faded cursive. He brushed the dirt away and smiled. Proof that the stories were true, at least a little. The bottle cap became his talisman. He cleaned it, set it on the windowsill by the sink, and each time he looked at it he felt strangely connected to whoever had dropped it 60 years ago. Maybe some bartender, maybe a customer who'd had one drink too many and stumbled out back to toss the cap away. The smallness of that relic made the past seem almost touchable. But beneath that quiet fascination was something else, an unspoken restlessness, the kind that comes when life feels too still, too clean. The city had once been chaos, full of sirens and motion. Out here, the silence pressed in like water. He began to walk the property more often, scanning the soil even when he wasn't using the detector. He started noticing details, the faint outline of old foundations, a patch of ground where grass refused to grow, the subtle slope that led toward the trees. By mid-autumn, the house had settled into a rhythm. Mornings smelled of coffee and rain-soaked wood. Evenings were filled with the hum of insects and the steady creak of the porch swing. The loneliness that had once felt like a wound began to feel more like a companion. Yet, sometimes when the wind blew from the west and the air carried the scent of rust, Michael would feel an odd awareness of the earth beneath him, as if something there remembered being disturbed. He didn't tell anyone about those moments. He wouldn't have known how. They weren't quite fear and not quite curiosity either. Just a sense that some stories never stay buried forever. A week before winter set in, he woke to the sound of rain against the roof and decided to take the detector out again. The soil would be soft, easy to dig. He wrapped himself in a flannel jacket, stepped into his boots, and walked out into the misty morning. The world smelled of wet leaves and iron. The first sweep of the coil over the backyard produced the usual soft chirps. He dug up a bent nail, then an old screw, but as he moved towards the center of the yard, near that slight depression in the earth, the detector's tone deepened, steady, strong, and unmistakable. A single, continuous signal, far clearer than any he had heard before. He froze, the rain pattering on his shoulders. He reset the machine and tried again. The same tone, long, low, metallic. Something big lay beneath him. Michael glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching from the fence line, but there was only the gray curtain of rain. The air felt different now, charged, expectant. He marked the spot with a wooden stake and knelt beside it, his hands trembling slightly as he pushed the first shovelful of mud aside. He dug only a foot before the blade struck something solid. The sound was dull and heavy, not like stone. He scraped away the mud with his fingers and saw a glint of metal, smooth, curved, red beneath the grime. For a moment, he thought it was some kind of old pipe or buried barrel, but as he cleared more soil, the shape widened, following a graceful contour. Rain dripped from his hood, streaking the dirt on his hands. He leaned closer, tracing the edge of the surface. It was painted metal, not rusted through despite the decades of burial. And on one corner, barely visible under a layer of clay, was a thin strip of chrome trim. He sat back on his heels, heart thudding. There, beneath his backyard, something man-made slept. Something much larger than he had ever imagined. He didn't know yet what it was, or what kind of story waited in that earth, but he felt in that instant that his quiet life had just changed. The rain kept falling, washing the dirt from the red metal, revealing more of it, an elegant curve, the suggestion of a roof line. Michael stared, unblinking, as realization crept through him. He was not digging into random soil anymore. He was unearthing a car. And, as the rain thickened and the day darkened, he felt a strange chill run through him as though the ground itself had been holding its breath for 60 years, waiting for someone to finally listen. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the yard damp and glistening in the pale light. A thin fog hovered over the grass, clinging to the fence posts like smoke reluctant to rise. Michael stood at the kitchen window, a cup of coffee warm in his hands, and stared at the patch of ground where he had left his shovel the night before. The red metal gleamed faintly through the mud, as if reminding him that what he'd found wasn't a dream. He had unearthed something impossible, and the knowledge of it sat in his chest like a stone. The logical part of his mind told him to stop, to fill the hole, forget about it, and pretend the signal from the detector had been nothing more than a buried water tank or an old septic system. But curiosity had already taken root. He had felt it the moment the shovel struck that smooth metallic curve, the pull of the unknown, the hunger for answers that reason could not quiet. He finished his coffee and went out to the yard. The ground squelched under his boots, soft and cold. The shovel leaned where he had left it, its blade rusted from the rain. He crouched beside the exposed metal and brushed away the layer of wet clay. The red paint beneath had darkened, but even under decades of soil it still caught the morning light. It wasn't pipe or machinery. The contour was too clean, too deliberate. It looked like part of a vehicle's body. He fetched the metal detector and switched it on, adjusting the sensitivity. The device came alive with a steady hum. When he passed the coil over the area, the tone rose instantly, a deep, sustained signal powerful enough to make the handle vibrate. He tried moving a few feet to the left, then right. The sound weakened only slightly. Whatever lay under there was large, larger than anything he had ever uncovered before. He spent the next 2 hours digging, stopping only to rest his back and wipe the sweat that mixed with the lingering drizzle. The earth was thick with roots and compacted clay, but he pushed through, driven by a strange excitement that bordered on obsession. Each shovelful revealed more metal, more curves, more lines that refused to be random. By midday, he had uncovered a section nearly 3 feet wide. The shape was unmistakable now, a portion of a roof, slightly flattened with a chrome ridge running along the side. He could see the faint outline of a windshield frame, its glass long shattered and fused with mud. He stood there in stunned silence, rain dripping from his sleeves, realizing that an entire car, had been buried beneath his backyard. The question that followed came unbidden. Why? Cars didn't end up underground by accident, not like this. Someone had put it there deliberately, sealing it beneath the soil for reasons lost to time. He found himself staring at the buried metal as if it might answer him, as if the car itself carried a memory of what had happened. The sound of tires on gravel made him turn. Ray Patterson's old pickup truck rolled to a stop near the fence, the engine coughing before it quieted. Ray stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. "You startin' an excavation business back here?" he called, a crooked grin on his weathered face. Michael managed a weak smile. "Something like that. You remember that story you told me about the nightclub that used to be here?" Ray walked closer, peering into the hole. When he saw the exposed roof line, his expression changed. The grin faded. He squatted at the edge, his eyes narrowing. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "That's no junker. That's a car. A fancy one by the look of it. Any idea how it got here?" Ray didn't answer right away. He just stared at the red metal, his jaw tightening. Finally, he said quietly, "You might not want to keep digging, son." Michael frowned. "Why not?" "Because sometimes the past stays buried for a reason." Ray looked up at him, his voice low. "If that's what I think it is, then there's a story attached, and stories like that don't end tidy." Michael crossed his arms, studying the car. "You think this has to do with that nightclub?" Ray hesitated, then sighed. "Could be. My old man used to talk about a fellow who ran the place back in the 50s. Rich guy, sharp dresser, always driving a red convertible. One night, he disappeared. Folks said he skipped town after some trouble with the mob, but others said he never left. Guess maybe they weren't wrong." The two men stood in silence, the air between them heavy with the weight of suggestion. Finally, Ray straightened up, his knees cracking. "Listen," he said. "If you're smart, you'll call the county and have them handle it. Don't make it your problem." Michael nodded but didn't promise anything. When Ray's truck finally rattled away down the road, the yard fell silent again. He looked back at the hole. The idea of stopping now felt impossible. The car had become more than a curiosity. It was a question demanding an answer. He fetched his tools and returned to work. The afternoon sun burned away the fog, and the ground began to dry. Inch by inch, he widened the trench around the buried vehicle. He uncovered the curve of a fender, the remnants of a headlight rim, and what looked like the tip of a side mirror. Each discovery deepened the sense that he was trespassing into someone else's forgotten chapter. By dusk, he had exposed nearly half the car. The metal still held a dull shine beneath the grime. Judging by the design, it was from the 1950s. Sleek lines, graceful curves, a symbol of wealth and style from a vanished America. The windshield was shattered inward, its edges crusted with soil. The side windows were gone entirely, replaced by the darkness of whatever remained inside. He set the shovel down and wiped his hands on his jeans, breathing hard. His fingers ached and his shoulders throbbed from the effort, but he couldn't stop staring. The car looked almost intact, preserved by the earth like a fossil, and then he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The doors were sealed. Not closed, sealed. A crude, uneven line of metal ran along each frame, the rough edges glinting under the fading light. It wasn't factory work. It was the result of someone welding the doors shut from the outside. Whoever had done it wanted to make sure no one opened them again. A chill moved through him despite the warmth of the evening. He leaned closer, touching the seam. The welds were thick and old, eaten by rust but still solid. He followed them with his eyes, tracing the same marks along the trunk lid. The entire vehicle had been entombed, shut tight as a coffin. He stepped back, uneasy now. The story Ray had told echoed in his mind. The missing man, the red convertible, the rumors. Maybe this was the same car. Maybe the man hadn't driven away after all. The thought made his chest constrict. He told himself it was ridiculous. He was no detective, just a man who liked to dig. But when he closed his eyes, he could almost see it. The gleam of the car rolling out of that long-gone nightclub, the night air thick with smoke and music, the driver unaware that his journey would end beneath this patch of dirt. Twilight deepened. Crickets began their chorus, and a single light blinked on in the house. He should have gone inside, but he lingered, staring at the exposed shell. The silence around it felt heavy, like the ground was holding its breath again. He reached down to gather his tools, but his hand hesitated. He needed to know more. He wanted to open it, to see inside, to prove or disprove the story forming in his head. But the idea of cutting into the metal in the dark felt wrong, almost sacrilegious. He covered the car loosely with a tarp, weighed it down with bricks, and turned toward the house. As he reached the porch, he glanced back one last time. Under the tarp's edges, the chrome bumper caught the last glint of sunset, gleaming like an unblinking eye. That night, sleep refused to come. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old house. The image of the welded doors would not leave his mind. He thought of Ray's warning, of secrets that didn't end tidy, and wondered if he had already crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Around midnight, a gust of wind rattled the windows, and for a heartbeat he thought he heard the faint chime of metal from the yard, a dull, hollow sound as if something beneath the tarp had shifted. He held his breath, straining to listen, but the noise did not come again. Only the silence pressed close, thick, and alive. When dawn finally came, he rose before the alarm, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The tarp lay undisturbed, heavy with dew. Birds called from the trees, indifferent to the secret sleeping under the soil. He stood there a long moment, the morning light cutting across the damp ground, and felt the pull again, the same inexorable pull that had drawn his shovel into the dirt. He knew then that he wouldn't be able to stop. Not now. The car was part of his world, and whatever it held, he had to see it through. He walked back inside to fetch his gloves and tools, his heartbeat steady and resolute. By the time he returned to the yard, the fog had lifted, and the sun burned bright over the field. The shovel sank easily into the wet earth, and each stroke felt heavier, more deliberate. The car waited beneath him like a sleeping beast, half revealed, half concealed, its secrets pressed tight behind layers of welded steel and years of silence. And as he dug, he could no longer tell whether he was uncovering a relic of history or opening a grave. The morning after he made up his mind to continue, the world seemed unnaturally quiet, as though even the air were waiting to see what he would do. The sun rose weakly through a veil of gray clouds, giving the yard a washed-out color, the kind of light that made everything look older. The tarp he had thrown over the car glistened with dew, and the wet grass clung to his boots as he crossed the yard. His breath came out in small white clouds. Autumn was deepening, and the air had that sharp, metallic taste that hinted of approaching frost. Michael had barely slept. The thought of what might be sealed inside the car had chased him through the night like an echo he couldn't escape. When he pulled the tarp back, revealing the dull red roof, his pulse quickened. There it was, exactly as he had left it, half buried, half revealed, an enigma resting beneath his own backyard. The previous night's wind had swept away some of the loose dirt, exposing more of the roof line and a sliver of chrome trim that gleamed faintly under the morning light. He decided to go further. He called a small rental company in town and arranged for a mini excavator, telling the man on the phone that he was leveling out his backyard for a garden. By mid-morning, the machine arrived on a trailer pulled by a man who looked too curious for comfort. Michael paid him in cash and sent him away as quickly as possible. He didn't want an audience. As he started the excavator, its engine coughed to life, breaking the stillness with its coarse growl. The bucket cut into the earth easily, rolling back layers of clay and compacted soil. The air filled with the smell of damp dirt and oil. Each scoop revealed more of the buried vehicle, its lines emerging from the earth like the bones of something ancient and beautiful. The fenders curved gracefully, the hood stretched long and elegant. Even through the grime, Michael could tell it had once been a stunning car, something that must have turned heads when it rolled through the streets decades ago. He stopped the excavator and climbed down, using a shovel to clear away the dirt by hand. The car's form became clearer. A convertible, its top collapsed and partially crushed under the weight of time. The once vibrant paint had dulled to a bruised red, and the chrome trim was freckled with corrosion. He ran his fingers along the roof's edge, feeling the cold metal beneath his gloves. The soil had preserved it in a strange way. Instead of falling apart, the car seemed to have been embalmed by the ground. As he worked, a strange quiet came over him. The rumble of the machine faded behind him, and all he could hear was his own breathing and the scrape of the shovel. It felt almost like an excavation of memory, as if he were digging not into earth but into something older, deeper, something that did not wish to be found. By early afternoon, nearly the entire car was visible. It was a 1950s convertible, likely American-made, with sweeping curves and elegant lines that spoke of a different age, a time when cars were symbols of success, of pride, of freedom. But the sight of it didn't bring joy. Instead, it filled him with a growing unease. He circled the vehicle slowly, inspecting every inch. The more he looked, the more wrong it appeared. Every door was welded shut, sealed by thick lines of rusted metal that had been roughly applied. The welds were not uniform. Some ran jaggedly, as though done in haste. When he reached the back of the car, he noticed the same treatment on the trunk, thick, irregular seams where someone had sealed it permanently. A chill passed through him. He crouched low, running his gloved hand over one of the welds. The touch sent a tremor up his arm. There was something deliberate about the work, something fearful. Whoever had done this hadn't been trying to preserve the car. They had been trying to lock it away. He stood and stepped back, taking in the entire sight. The machine was entombed perfectly, as though someone had wanted it never to see light again. It wasn't junk buried for convenience. It was a secret, deliberately hidden. He fetched his flashlight and peered through the cracked windshield. The interior was a dark blur. He wiped at the glass with his sleeve, but the mud and condensation inside made it impossible to see clearly. He could just make out the faint shape of the steering wheel, its chrome spokes catching the light. The seats had rotted to black shadows. Something about that emptiness made his skin crawl. He moved to the side, where the glass of the passenger window had shattered. leaving a small hole through which the smell of old decay wafted. It was faint, but distinct, like wet leather and something else, something sour and long dead. Michael recoiled instinctively, the scent turning his stomach. He straightened up and looked toward the house. From this angle, the two-story structure looked small and distant, like a witness pretending not to see. He felt suddenly exposed, as though the entire world were watching him uncover something he shouldn't. As he stood there, the sound of crunching gravel broke the silence. He turned to see Ray's old truck pull up again. The man climbed out slowly, hat pulled low, eyes wary. "I figured you'd keep going," Ray said, his tone more weary than surprised. Michael didn't answer. He just gestured toward the car. Ray approached the edge of the pit and whistled softly. "Lord above, you dug the whole damn thing out." He squatted down, rubbing his chin. "That's a beauty once, no doubt. Looks like a Cadillac, maybe a 56 or 57. Shame what they did to her." "What they did?" Michael repeated. Ray nodded toward the welded doors. "You see that? That's no accident. Someone didn't want this thing opened again. Not ever. Why would someone do that?" Ray hesitated, eyes distant. "Back in the day, this area wasn't as quiet as it is now. The Silver Lounge drew all kinds. Politicians, mobsters, girls with dreams too big for their pockets. Money flowed easy, and so did trouble. Folks said the owner, a fellow named Richard Wallace, made enemies fast. Then, one night, he just vanished. Him and his car, both." Michael stared at the vehicle, the truth starting to press on him with the weight of the soil he had moved. "You think this is his car?" "I think it's got the same red paint I remember from the stories," Ray said softly. "And I think if that trunk ever opens, you might not like what you find inside." He rose to his feet and looked Michael squarely in the eye. "You got two choices, son. You can call the police now and let them deal with it, or you can keep digging and make this mess yours." With that, Ray walked back to his truck and drove off, leaving behind only the fading sound of the engine and a cloud of dust that drifted slowly through the sunlight. Michael stood still for a long time after he was gone. The words echoed in his head, "Make this mess yours." He turned back to the car. The welded seams caught the afternoon light, glowing faintly red and copper like scars on a corpse. He tried to tell himself that this was just an old vehicle, that maybe it had been buried during construction or dumped to save disposal fees. But none of that explained the welds. None of that explained the smell. He went back to the excavator and began clearing the remaining dirt from around the tires, uncovering the wheels and the undercarriage. The tires were deflated but intact, the white wall rims still visible through the grime. He could see the manufacturer's insignia faintly embossed on the hubcaps. They were indeed Cadillac. By evening, the car stood fully unearthed in its pit, resting on a thin layer of compacted clay. It looked strangely out of place, something elegant and graceful surrounded by ruin. He shut off the excavator and sat down on the edge of the hole, breathing heavily. His muscles ached and his hands were blistered, but the exhaustion was drowned out by adrenaline. The car was real. The story was real. And somewhere inside that sealed shell lay the reason for it all. The first stars appeared overhead as the sun slipped behind the horizon. Crickets began their nightly song, indifferent to the turmoil in his chest. He switched on his flashlight again and shined it along the trunk, tracing the jagged weld. The beam caught on something small and metallic near the latch, a faint glint that looked like a padlock fragment, rusted to dust. Someone had not only sealed the trunk, but locked it before doing so. He sat there for a long time, staring at it, until the air grew cold and his breath came out in faint clouds. He thought about calling the sheriff, about ending the mystery here, but something inside him resisted. Maybe it was the stubbornness of a man who'd spent his life fixing things, who couldn't stand leaving a job half done. Or maybe it was something deeper, a need to understand what kind of secret was buried beneath his own home. As he rose to his feet, the flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. He turned toward the house. From the back porch, its windows glowed faintly, warm and inviting, like a promise of safety. He could go inside, close the door, and let it all wait until morning. But he knew he wouldn't sleep anyway. The night wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a whisper of old stories, of music, laughter, engines, and the sharp echo of a gunshot lost to time. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in guilt, and the ground beneath him felt thick with it. He walked back to the car, crouched beside the trunk, and placed his hand on the cold metal. The surface was slick with condensation, but beneath it he felt the solid, stubborn resistance of something that didn't want to give. Not yet, he thought. Not tonight. He stepped away, turned off the flashlight, and looked at the dark outline of the car one last time before heading toward the house. The excavator stood silent behind him, the dirt piled high like the edge of a grave. When he reached the porch, he paused, feeling the night pressing close around him. The yard smelled of iron and damp earth. He looked back once more, and the moon slipped out from behind the clouds, casting a pale glow over the scene. The red car shimmered faintly, half in light, half in shadow, as though it were waiting patiently for him to return. And he knew he would. He would come back tomorrow when the sun was up and the fear had dulled, and he would find a way to open that trunk. Because the car was more than a mystery now, it was a question buried in his own soil, and questions like that didn't let a man rest until he dug out every last answer. When morning came, the frost had crept over the ground, turning every blade of grass silver and brittle. The excavator stood silent beside the open pit, its metal frame beaded with dew. The red car beneath it looked almost peaceful in the pale light, as though it had accepted its return to the world after so many years of sleep. Michael stood on the porch for a long time, hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee that had long gone cold. The night had left him restless, haunted by vague images that refused to fade, a muffled banging from within the trunk, the sound of a horn echoing somewhere underground, the faint shimmer of headlights buried in soil. Each time he closed his eyes, the images returned. It was not fear that kept him awake, not exactly. It was the knowledge that there was only one way to silence those echoes. He had to see what was inside. By mid-morning, he was in the pit again, clearing the last layer of dirt around the car. The ground steamed faintly where the sun touched it, releasing the scent of wet clay and rust. He had slept no more than a few hours, but his body felt alert, almost feverish. Every movement had a rhythm. Dig, scrape, breathe, repeat, as though some invisible force were guiding him forward. The weld lines on the trunk gleamed faintly, thin threads of copper and decay that caught the light each time he brushed the dirt away. He crouched beside the trunk and examined the seams again. They were thick, uneven, a crude job done quickly by someone who wanted permanence more than beauty. Whoever sealed the car had meant for it to stay sealed. The thought filled him with a strange kind of defiance. He went to the shed and returned with a gas-cutting torch, the same tool he had once used to dismantle old electrical boxes when he worked construction. He checked the tank, tightened the valve, and lit the flame. The hiss of gas filled the cold morning air, sharp and alive. The blue fire licked against the trunk's edge, and the metal hissed in protest. The smell of burning rust and old paint stung his nose. He worked slowly, drawing the line of heat across the welded seam, sparks cascading into the pit like a rain of orange light. The noise seemed to fill the entire yard, drowning out the birds and the hum of the wind. Sweat rolled down his temple despite the chill, and he could feel the vibration of the torch reverberate through his arms. It took nearly an hour to cut through the seal. The car's metal had fused with time itself, and every inch felt like fighting through bone. When, at last, he extinguished the torch, smoke curled up from the trunk's edge, carrying the heavy scent of scorched decay. He set the torch aside and waited for the metal to cool, his heart beating too fast, his hands trembling despite his effort to steady them. He reached for a crowbar and wedged it into the gap he had carved. The trunk gave a low groan, as though resisting him one last time, then yielded with a slow, wet creak. A breath of air escaped, a foul, stagnant exhalation that had been trapped for decades. He stumbled back, gagging at the smell, a mix of mold, rust, and something unmistakably organic. When he lifted the trunk fully, the morning sunlight fell inside, and what it revealed made his knees weaken. There, curled within the confines of the trunk, lay what remained of a human being. The skeleton was half collapsed, bones tangled with what was once clothing, now reduced to blackened scraps of fabric. The skull rested at an unnatural angle, one hollow eye socket facing him as if in accusation. Beside the bones sat a large leather suitcase, cracked and stiff from age, and a scatter of papers turned to pulp. The sight froze him completely. The reality of what he had done, the truth of what this car was, hit him with the cold weight of the grave itself. He had found not a relic, but a tomb. Michael stood motionless for a long time, unable to look away. The air in the pit seemed to thicken, pressing down on him until he had to draw in sharp, shallow breaths. There was a part of him that wanted to close the trunk, bury it again, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But another part, stronger, darker, refused to move until it understood the story the bones were trying to tell. Finally, with shaking hands, he reached into the trunk and lifted the suitcase. It was heavier than it should have been, the leather slick with age. The clasps were corroded but intact. He hesitated, the smell rising up around him like a warning, and then he forced them open. Inside was a collection of time turned to ruin. Bundles of documents, contracts, receipts, photographs had fused together in damp decay. He could make out only fragments. A faded letterhead reading "The Silver Lounge," a torn check signed by a name that started with R. There were personal effects, too. A gold watch stopped forever at 2:14, a monogrammed handkerchief, and a set of cufflinks shaped like small crowns. Beneath it all, tucked into the lining of the case, was a small leather briefcase bound with a strap. That, at least, had survived intact. He pulled it free, his heart hammering. The briefcase opened easily, revealing a stack of yellowed papers tied with string. The writing on the top sheet was faint but legible. Bank transfers, property deeds, and what looked like lists of names. There were signatures, some familiar from old local lore, city officials, police chiefs, businessmen who had all died decades ago. It was corruption, laid bare. A ledger of the deals that had built the city's underbelly, each page a record of someone who had sold a piece of their soul for money. Michael flipped through the pages, the realization dawning slowly and heavily. This wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was the heart of one. The body in the trunk, the welded doors, the secrecy, all of it began to make sense. Whoever had buried this car hadn't just wanted to hide a murder, they had wanted to bury a scandal big enough to ruin an entire generation. He sat down on the edge of the pit, the briefcase resting on his knees. The sun had risen higher, but the warmth couldn't reach him down there. The shadows of the car walls felt like the edges of a coffin. For a long time, he didn't move. His mind tried to make order out of chaos, to find logic in the horror. The smell, the bones, the papers, it was all too much to hold at once. He thought of the man Ray had mentioned, Richard Wallace, the owner of the Silver Lounge. A man who had disappeared without a trace, whose name had been whispered in connection with politicians and mobsters alike. The initials on the cufflinks, R.W., left little room for doubt. Michael was staring at what was left of him. He climbed out of the pit slowly, his legs weak beneath him. The world above felt different now, smaller and sharper. He walked to the house, dirt still clinging to his clothes, and dialed the number for the local sheriff. His voice trembled only slightly as he explained what he had found. The dispatcher's tone changed the moment he mentioned human remains. Within an hour, the sound of approaching sirens broke the rural quiet. Police cars pulled up along the fence, their tires crunching on the gravel. Uniformed officers stepped out, followed by detectives in plain clothes. Michael stood aside, answering questions as they cordoned off the area. They photographed everything: the car, the trunk, the suitcase, even his shovel. The smell of decay drew grimaces and muttered curses from the officers, but they kept working, their professionalism holding firm against the morbid curiosity in their eyes. When the medical examiner arrived, she moved with the calm precision of someone used to death. She examined the bones in silence, murmuring to her assistant as they took samples and placed the remains carefully into evidence bags. The chief detective, a broad-shouldered man with gray hair, asked Michael to walk him through everything. Michael told the truth from the moment he found the signal on the metal detector to the instant the trunk opened. He left nothing out, not even his doubts, not even Ray's warnings. The detective listened without interruption. When Michael finished, the man nodded slowly. "You did the right thing calling us," he said. "Whatever this is, it's been waiting a long time." They took the briefcase and the papers, promising to contact him once they had analyzed everything. By late afternoon, the car was lifted out of the ground with heavy machinery, its tires dangling, mud cascading from the undercarriage. For a moment, it looked like some massive animal being raised from a swamp, a relic of both beauty and horror. The crowd that had gathered along the fence, neighbors, reporters, strangers, watched in silence. When the crane set the car down on a flatbed, one of the detectives turned to Michael. "Looks like you just solved a 60-year mystery," he said quietly. But Michael didn't feel like he had solved anything. He felt only the weight of what had been uncovered, the story of a man who thought he could outsmart corruption, only to be swallowed by it. As the trucks drove away and the crowd dispersed, the yard fell silent again. The hole gaped open, a dark wound in the earth. Michael stood at its edge, the wind tugging at his sleeves, and tried to imagine the night all those years ago when someone had driven the car into that pit. He could almost hear it, the hum of the engine, the hiss of the torch sealing the doors, the dull thud of shovels piling dirt over metal. It must have been quiet afterward, just like it was now, quiet enough that the men responsible could walk away and never look back, trusting the earth to keep their secret. But the earth remembers. That night, after the police left, Michael sat on his porch again. The stars were faint, blurred by the glow of the town in the distance. He stared out over the yard, now marked by yellow tape and deep tire tracks, and tried to convince himself that it was over. The body had been found, the evidence taken. He had done what any good man should have done. Yet beneath that rational thought was another, quieter one. He had disturbed something that wasn't finished. Secrets like this didn't end just because the bones were gone. They lingered, like the smell that still hung faintly in the cold night air. He finished his coffee and went inside, but before closing the door, he looked once more toward the pit. The moonlight fell across it in pale ribbons catching on the damp soil. He thought of the welded doors, of the papers in the briefcase, of the initials engraved on the cufflinks. Somewhere, in some old photograph or dusty record, there would be faces that matched those names. Men who had once smiled for the camera, shaking hands over deals sealed in smoke-filled rooms. And now, their silence had been broken. He switched off the porch light, leaving the yard in darkness. The night wind rose again, carrying the faint scent of rust and burnt metal, and in the distance a dog barked once, then stopped. Michael lay in bed for a long time before sleep took him, listening to the house creak around him. When dreams finally came, they were filled with the sound of shovels striking earth and the slow, heavy creak of a trunk opening somewhere in the dark. The following week passed in a blur of phone calls, interviews, and restless nights. The quiet life Michael had built for himself was gone. His house, once just another forgotten building on the outskirts of town, had become a site of fascination, its backyard taped off and patrolled by uniformed officers. News vans lined the road for days, their satellite dishes turning like sunflowers toward whatever angle would best capture the red car being hauled away. They called it the Silver Lounge Car, and the name spread faster than the truth. At first, Michael tried to avoid it all. He stayed inside, curtains drawn, phone ringing until it stopped. The sound of his own name on television made his skin crawl. They painted him as a local hero, the man who had solved a half-century mystery, but the word hero felt wrong in his mouth. He hadn't solved anything. He had just been too stubborn to stop digging. Still, people wanted stories. They wanted faces to attach to the dead. It was 2 days later when Detective Howard came back, his heavy frame filling the doorway, hat in his hands and fatigue in his eyes. He looked like a man carrying too much history. They sat at the kitchen table where the air still smelled faintly of coffee and burnt dust. "The remains are confirmed," Howard said quietly. "Dental records match a Richard Wallace. You probably heard the name from your neighbor already." Michael nodded. Ray mentioned him, the nightclub owner. Owner, fixer, middleman, depends on who you ask. Howard flipped open a file, the paper creasing under his broad fingers. He was under investigation in 1961. Federal corruption probe tied to organized crime, bribes, extortion, the works. Then, one night he disappears. No body, no car. The case went cold within months. Until now. He pushed a photograph across the table. It was a black and white picture of a man in a suit leaning against the very same red convertible. The smile on his face was wide, almost arrogant, his hair slicked back with perfect precision. Behind him, a neon sign flickered faintly, the Silver Lounge. Michael stared at the photograph. It felt strange seeing the car as it had been, alive, gleaming, part of a world full of light and noise. "What happened to him?" he asked. Howard sighed, as if the story had been living in his lungs for too long. He made the wrong enemies. Wallace started working with federal agents to bring down a group of local officials who'd been laundering money through his club. He was going to testify. But word got out, and before he could talk, he vanished. Everyone assumed he ran, maybe fled the country. Turns out he didn't make it farther than your backyard. The words settled between them like dust. Michael felt them sink into him, heavy and unshakable. He thought of the sealed trunk, the papers, the welded doors. The car hadn't just been a hiding place, it had been a coffin built in panic. "What about the documents?" he asked. "They're still being examined," Howard replied. "But if the briefcase is what we think it is, it ties together half the city's political scandals from that era. Names people still recognize. Some of their children are sitting on the town council now." Michael's stomach turned. "So they killed him to keep it quiet." "Most likely," Howard said, closing the file, "and they buried him during construction of the parking lot that used to stand there. We found records showing the Silver Lounge burned down that same month, and within weeks a new development went up. Convenient, right?" He stood, resting his hat on his head. "You should know, Mr. Jenkins, this will stay in the news for a while. The state's reopening the case as a historical investigation. There's going to be pressure, questions, maybe even threats from people who'd rather this stayed buried. If anyone bothers you, call us." After he left, the silence returned, thick and uneven. Michael sat at the table long after the detective's truck disappeared down the road. The photo of Richard Wallace still lay before him. The man's grin seemed to mock him now, as if he were daring the living to untangle the mess he'd left behind. That night, sleep came only in fragments. Every creak of the house sounded like a door opening, every distant engine like the purr of the convertible rising from its grave. He dreamt of the car again, but this time it wasn't buried. It was moving through city streets, neon flashing off its hood, laughter spilling from the club windows. Then the laughter turned to shouting, gunfire, and finally the sound of metal scraping metal, a sound that grew until it swallowed everything. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat. The sky outside was a deep gray, the kind that comes before a storm. He went out to the porch, wrapped in his jacket, and watched the clouds shift above the dark line of trees. The police had left tire tracks through the yard, deep grooves that filled with rainwater. The pit where the car had rested was now just an open wound of mud. He couldn't look at it without feeling something hollow open in his chest. Over the next few days, reporters kept showing up, some polite, some pushy. They wanted him on camera, wanted emotion, wanted a soundbite about how it felt to solve history. He turned them all away. One evening, he found a man in a gray suit waiting by his fence. The man introduced himself as a historian from the state university, there to document the site for the archives. His tone was soft, but his questions were precise, too precise. When he asked if Michael had kept any of the papers, Michael felt a sudden instinctive tension, as though something unseen had shifted in the air. "I gave everything to the police," he said flatly. The historian smiled, but his eyes didn't. "Good," he said. "Best to let the past stay with the people who know how to handle it." Then he left, walking slowly back toward the road, his shoes sinking into the soft earth. That night, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing at the edge of his yard after dark, just beyond the light of the porch lamp. He told himself it was paranoia, the echo of too many late-night news reports. But even when he closed the curtains, he still felt eyes on him. 2 days later, he saw Ray again. The old mechanic had been avoiding the cameras, keeping to himself. When he finally showed up, he looked more tired than usual. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. "They're saying it was Wallace," he said quietly. "I figured it might be." Michael studied him. "You sound like you knew him." Ray nodded slowly. "Not personally, but my father did. Worked on his cars. He said Wallace was a man who liked to keep friends close and enemies closer. Only thing was, he didn't always know which was which." He looked out toward the muddy hole, smoke drifting from his lips. "You know, there's something else folks forget. Wallace wasn't just a crook. He was scared. Last month, before he vanished, he tried to sell the club. Told people he wanted out. But once you're in that life, you don't get out clean." Michael listened in silence. The story sounded like a warning told too late. "Do you think anyone still cares about him? After all this time?" Ray's eyes narrowed. "Care? Maybe not. But people remember debts, even old ones. You stirred up ghosts that don't rest easy, Jenkins. Be careful who you talk to." After Ray left, the yard felt emptier somehow. The rain had stopped, but the air was still heavy with it. Michael sat on the porch until darkness fell, thinking about what Ray had said. It wasn't just a buried car anymore. It was a thread leading backward through generations of secrets. And he had pulled it loose. When the call from the detective finally came the next morning, he already knew what it would be. The results from the documents confirmed widespread corruption. Money funneled through city contracts, kickbacks to officials, police protection for criminal operations. The names listed in those papers were more than just history. They were legacy. Some of the families still owned half the businesses downtown. "This discovery is going to reopen a lot of old wounds," Howard told him over the phone. "It's not just a murder case anymore. It's the kind of thing that reshapes how a town sees itself." Michael stared out the window at the bare trees swaying in the wind. "And what happens now?" "Now?" The detective hesitated. "Now the lawyers will fight, the historians will argue, and the rest of us will try to pretend we understand justice. For you, though, I'd recommend getting away for a while." After the call ended, Michael sat for a long time in the stillness. The suggestion made sense, yet he couldn't bring himself to leave. The house had become part of the story now, its walls soaked in the echo of everything unearthed. Leaving felt like abandoning a witness. As the days stretched into weeks, the frenzy faded. The reporters moved on to new stories, the police packed their equipment, and the town returned to its usual rhythm. But for Michael, the quiet was heavier than before. The backyard no longer felt like his own. When the wind blew through the trees, it carried the faint metallic scent of rust, the ghost of the car still lingering beneath the soil even though it was gone. One evening, he found himself standing at the edge of the pit again, staring down at the damp earth. The sun had set, and the sky glowed faintly orange, the light catching in the puddles. He imagined Wallace there, sitting behind the wheel of his perfect car, unaware of the betrayal waiting for him. Maybe he had trusted someone, an associate, a friend, a lover, and that trust had ended with a gun in his face. Maybe he had begged. Or maybe he had simply closed his eyes and waited. Whatever had happened, it was over long before Michael was born, yet somehow he felt responsible. The dead had been silent for decades, and he had given them back their voice. He took a deep breath and turned away. The smell of wet soil clung to his clothes. As he stepped onto the porch, he glanced toward the street. Across the road, in the dim glow of a street lamp, a figure stood watching. It was too dark to make out features, just a silhouette. Still, patient, as if waiting for him to notice. Michael froze. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. He told himself it was nothing, just his imagination playing tricks on him after too many sleepless nights. But when he went back inside, he locked the door for the first time since he'd moved in. The news might have said the case was solved, but in his bones he knew otherwise. The ground might give up its dead, but the past never released its hold that easily. It stayed buried in people, in memories, in families, in the corners of history that no one dared to sweep clean. And as he stood at the window, watching the rain begin again, Michael Jenkins understood something he hadn't before. Once you dig into the past, you don't just uncover what's gone. You uncover yourself, too, the parts that are better left under the soil. The nights grew colder after the discovery, and the frost lingered longer on the windowsills each morning. For the first time since moving into the old house, Michael began to feel uneasy walking through it. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder, every draft colder. It wasn't the thought of the car itself that unsettled him. After all, it was gone now, hauled away to a forensic lab somewhere, but rather what it had left behind. It was as if the ground still whispered, carrying with it the residue of betrayal, fear, and silence. The space where the car had rested was now just a shallow depression filled with rainwater, a dull reflection of the gray sky. But to Michael, it looked more like an open eye staring upward, unblinking, watching. The days passed slowly, and the excitement that had once surrounded him faded into something else, something heavier. The newspapers had stopped calling him a hero and started calling him the accidental detective. A few even hinted that maybe he had been searching for the car deliberately, that maybe he'd known what was buried there all along. He ignored them, but the whispers lingered. He could feel the shift in how people looked at him at the grocery store, at the gas station, even at the diner where he used to eat breakfast on Sundays. They weren't smiles of gratitude anymore. They were glances edged with curiosity and discomfort. No one wanted to sit too close to the man who had dug up the town's buried sins. He thought about leaving sometimes. The detective had even suggested it, gently, as though he were advising a friend to escape a storm before it worsened. But something anchored Michael to that house. Maybe it was pride, or guilt, or some strange sense of duty to finish what he had started. He had turned over the soil of this place, and now it felt wrong to abandon it. Every nail in the walls, every cracked tile, every shadow seemed to hold a story he hadn't yet learned. The police kept in touch, at first every few days, then only occasionally. Detective Howard would call to update him on the investigation, though each conversation sounded more like a confession of frustration. Too many people involved, Howard had said one afternoon, his voice dry and tired over the phone. Half the men in those papers are dead. The other half have sons who'd rather the past stay quiet. I'm afraid this case might end up as just another piece of history. Michael had only nodded, though the detective couldn't see it. He didn't have the energy to fight or the will to care about justice anymore. The truth had been found, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like infection, something that spread once it touched air. Then, a week after their last conversation, he received a letter in the mail. The envelope was unmarked, no return address, only his name written in sharp, narrow handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper with a short message typed on an old machine. You should have left it buried. There was no signature, no hint of who had sent it. The words were precise, almost surgical. For a long time he just stood in the kitchen, the note trembling in his hands. When he finally looked up, his reflection in the window seemed unfamiliar, older somehow. He told himself it was a prank, someone from town trying to scare him, maybe an old-timer angry that their family name had resurfaced in the headlines. Still, he couldn't bring himself to throw the letter away. He folded it carefully and locked it in the drawer beside the sink, telling himself it was evidence just in case. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was a reminder, a warning, that some secrets never truly die. That night, he dreamed again. He saw the red convertible, gleaming as it must have once been, cruising down a city street lined with neon signs and laughter. Richard Wallace sat behind the wheel, smiling like a man who believed he was untouchable. Then the street dissolved, swallowed by earth, and the car sank slowly into darkness. The headlights flickered once, twice, and went out. Michael woke gasping, his hands clenched around the sheets, his skin damp with sweat. The next morning brought no relief. The sun refused to break through the clouds, and the wind carried the brittle scent of winter. He went out to the yard to clear his head, but the air felt heavier there. The patch of earth where the car had been looked different now, as though the rain had washed away more than just dirt. Standing there, he could almost hear the hiss of the cutting torch again, the creak of the trunk opening, the whisper of long-dead voices returning to air. He wasn't alone for long. A familiar engine rumbled down the road, and Ray's truck appeared once more, old and gray like its owner. The man stepped out slower than usual, his hat pulled low, his hands deep in his jacket pockets. When he reached the porch, he didn't climb the steps right away. He just looked at Michael for a long moment before speaking. "They won't let this go," Ray said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "Who won't?" Ray exhaled smoke through his nose, the wind carrying it away. "The people who built this town. You think all that money and power just disappeared? No. It got handed down like family silver. The ones who buried Wallace weren't just crooks, they were building something. And you, my friend, you cracked the foundation." Michael frowned. "You're talking like you know them." "I knew enough," Ray said, his eyes somewhere far away. "My father used to fix cars for men like that. He said you could always tell the dangerous ones by how quiet they were. The loud ones wanted to be seen. The quiet ones, they were the ones with shovels." He paused, staring out at the field behind the house. "You ever think about what happens after you dig something up? Everyone sees the bones, the headlines, the truth. But what about the ground you disturbed? It doesn't just close up neat and clean. It stays open, waiting." Michael didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Ray dropped his cigarette into the dirt and ground it out with his boot. "I'm leaving town for a while," he said finally. "You should too." "I can't," Michael said. Ray nodded like he had expected that. "Then be careful. The past isn't done with you yet." When he drove away, the road felt emptier than it ever had. The echo of the truck faded slowly, leaving Michael alone with the wind and the rustle of dry leaves. That evening, as the sun slipped below the trees, a police cruiser stopped outside the house. Detective Howard stepped out, his face drawn tighter than usual. He climbed the porch steps and greeted Michael with a curt nod. "Got a minute?" Inside, he refused coffee, setting his hat on the table. "I shouldn't even be here," he said quietly, glancing toward the window. "But I thought you should know. The documents we pulled from the briefcase, half of them are missing." Michael froze. "Missing? How?" "They were transferred to a state archive 2 days ago. When the inventory was done this morning, the most incriminating pages were gone. Names, account numbers, the good stuff. someone knew exactly what to take. "Are you saying someone inside the department?" Howard raised a hand. "I'm not saying anything, but you should be careful who you talk to. I can't protect you from ghosts, Jenkins, and these are the kind that still have friends in high places." He stood and put his hat back on. "Lock your doors, stay alert. If anything feels wrong, call me, and if you get another letter, burn it." Michael nodded numbly, and the detective left without another word. That night, the wind howled like a wounded thing, rattling the windows and moaning through the trees. The electricity flickered twice, once plunging the house into total darkness. For a moment, standing in the quiet, Michael could have sworn he heard footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, heavy. He waited, holding his breath, but they faded away. When morning came, there was nothing outside but frost on the steps and a single footprint in the mud, half erased by the cold. The days that followed blurred together. The world moved on, but Michael couldn't. The hole in the yard began to fill naturally with rain and snow melt, the earth collapsing inward as if trying to heal itself. Yet, each time he looked at it, he saw more than dirt. He saw the shape of the car, the glint of chrome, the silent face of the man he had brought back into the world. He began taking long walks through the woods behind the house, hoping the air would clear his thoughts, but the forest, too, seemed to carry echoes. He'd find old bottles, rusted cans, pieces of wire, remnants of the same world that had hidden the car. Once, he came across a bent metal sign half buried in moss. When he wiped it clean, he saw the faded words, "Silver Lounge Parking. Customers only." He stood staring at it until the wind lifted it from his hands and toppled it into the leaves. He returned home to find another envelope on the porch. No handwriting this time, just a single black mark where his name should have been. Inside was a newspaper clipping, the same photo of him standing beside the unearthed car taken weeks ago. Someone had drawn a circle in red ink around his face. That night, he didn't sleep at all. He sat by the window, watching the empty road until dawn, waiting for headlights that never came. By the end of the week, even Ray had stopped answering his calls. The detective, too, had gone silent. The world was closing back over the story, swallowing it as though trying to undo what he had done. One evening, he found himself at the edge of the pit again, staring at the water pooled inside. The reflection showed his face distorted, broken by ripples. He thought of the man in the car, the secrets that had died with him, and how even truth, once unearthed, could rot in the air. He picked up a handful of wet soil and let it fall back through his fingers. "I'm sorry," he said softly, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to, the dead man, the detective himself, or the ground. The sound of his voice vanished quickly, swallowed by the wind. That night, the frost came early, spreading across the windows like veins. He sat alone in the living room, the silence pressing down on him, and realized that the real weight of what he had found wasn't the horror of the bones or the corruption of the past. It was the knowledge that some truths, once uncovered, can never be put back. The world doesn't thank you for digging them up. It just lets you live with them, alone, cold and awake, in a house that no longer feels like yours. Outside, the wind rose again, bending the trees until they groaned. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe the dead were right. Maybe he should have left it buried. Winter came quietly that year, creeping across the town in a slow gray hush. The leaves fell and vanished beneath a skin of frost, and the air turned brittle, thin enough to taste like metal. In the mornings, when the mist hung low over the yard, the earth where the car had once been lay sunken and pale, the grass refusing to grow there. It looked almost peaceful now, like the ground had exhaled the last of its secrets and decided to sleep again. But for Michael, the peace that everyone else seemed to find never came. The discovery had ended for the world. It was written, filed, forgotten, but it had not ended for him. The shadow of what he'd unearthed lingered like a smell that never washed away. He rarely left the house anymore. The noise of the city, even the chatter of the grocery store, felt wrong in his ears. Everything around him seemed louder now. Doors shutting, car engines starting, the crunch of tires on gravel at night. He had started to recognize the patterns of silence, too, the kind that filled the space before something happened. Sometimes he would wake before dawn and sit by the window, staring at the yard until the frost softened into fog. He would imagine that if he watched long enough, he might see the car again, might see its roof glinting faintly beneath the surface of the earth like a heartbeat in the soil. But the car was gone, and with it, most of the evidence. The police had moved on to other cases. The newspapers had folded the story into their archives. Even Detective Howard, who had once seemed steadfast, had called one last time to tell him that the investigation was formally concluded. The official statement was cautious. There was no living suspect, no clear proof of who had sealed the car or why. The world had turned the story into history, and history, Michael thought, was just another way to bury the truth. For a time, he tried to keep himself busy. He repaired the porch railing, fixed the gutters, even considered repainting the kitchen. But each task ended the same way, with him standing by the back door, staring out at the yard as though expecting someone to appear there. The silence of the place had changed. It was not the quiet of peace anymore, but the quiet that follows confession. One evening, in the thinning light, he walked down to the edge of the pit. The ground had hardened with frost, and the puddle that had gathered there was now a sheet of thin ice. Beneath it, he could still see faint shapes, the lines of the soil where the car's weight had pressed for decades. He crouched down, touching the surface gently. The ice cracked softly beneath his fingers, and the reflection of his face fractured into ripples of light. He whispered something, though he wasn't sure if it was a prayer or an apology. The next morning brought snow. It came quietly, without wind, a slow drift that settled on everything in sight. By midday, the yard was unrecognizable, smooth and white and clean. The scars of digging were gone. Even the hollow in the earth looked softer, almost erased. For the first time in months, Michael felt a kind of relief. He stood on the porch, watching the snow fall, and thought maybe this was the world's way of closing the wound. Days passed, each one folding into the next, as quiet and predictable as the snowfall itself. The town forgot about him. The mail stopped coming. The phone rarely rang. It was as if life were gently pushing him toward stillness, the way water smooths a stone. He didn't resist. He let the days move around him like slow water, filling the spaces where noise used to be. It was late in January when he decided to fill the pit. The snow had begun to melt, and the ground beneath was soft enough to work again. He borrowed a small shovel from Ray's abandoned garage. His neighbor had never returned from wherever he'd gone, and set to work. The act of shoveling felt strange, almost sacred. Each scoop of dirt was like a closing sentence in a story that had taken too long to tell. By dusk, the hollow was gone. The earth stood level once more, its surface smooth and unbroken. He built a wooden bench from the leftover planks in his shed and set it there, over the place where the car had once slept. It wasn't fancy, just sturdy and simple. He sat on it as the evening light faded, watching the sun bleed into the horizon. The air was cold enough to sting, but he didn't move. The bench faced west, and from there he could see the line of trees that bordered his property, their bare branches drawn dark against the pale sky. For the first time in a long while, the silence felt bearable. When spring came, he planted a young tree beside the bench. A maple, tall and thin, its roots shallow in the still soft soil. The process of planting it, digging the hole, pressing the roots, covering them with earth, felt familiar, almost too familiar. He worked slowly, his breath steady, the rhythm of the shovel soothing. When it was done, he stood back and looked at it for a long time. It swayed lightly in the wind, a living thing standing where death had once slept. He thought it was fitting. The weeks passed, and the world outside began to bloom again. The grass returned, though it grew paler near the bench. Birds built nests under the eaves of the porch. The house, which had once felt like a stranger's, began to soften in its edges, to feel like home again. Yet, even in this quiet renewal, the memories lingered. Some nights, when he sat on the bench, he would hear the faint hum of an engine in his mind, the soft purr of that buried car as it might have sounded when it was new. He imagined the shine of its paint under neon lights, the music from the silver lounge drifting into the night air. He thought of Richard Wallace, laughing and unaware of what was coming. And he thought of how easily a man could be swallowed by the world he helped build. The tree grew taller. Its leaves darkened from pale green to deep crimson in the summer light. Michael began to think of it less as a memorial and more as a witness, something that would stand long after he was gone, quietly keeping the truth that others had tried to erase. He didn't need to talk about it anymore. The papers, the police, the stories, they all belonged to someone else now. What remained was between him and the earth. One evening in late summer, he received a call from Detective Howard. His voice was quieter than usual, almost resigned. "They're closing the file," he said. "Officially this time. The papers were lost for good. Someone up the chain decided it wasn't worth pursuing. I thought you should hear it from me before you read it somewhere else." Michael didn't answer right away. He looked out the window at the tree, its branches swaying in the dusk. "I figured as much," he said finally. Howard hesitated. "You did the right thing, you know. You brought him home. That matters." "Maybe," Michael said, "but I don't think it changed anything." "Sometimes it doesn't," Howard said. "Sometimes it just stops the rot from spreading." There was a pause, and then the line went quiet. After the call, Michael went outside. The air smelled of rain, and the leaves of the young maple shimmered with droplets. He sat on the bench and listened to the sounds of the night. The chirping insects, the rustle of grass, the distant hum of the highway. For the first time in many months, he felt something like calm. Not peace exactly, but the faint, fragile kind of acceptance that comes when you realize the world doesn't owe you closure. He thought about what the detective had said, about rot and how easily it spreads. He looked down at the soil beneath his feet, rich and dark now, full of life. Maybe that was all any man could hope for, to keep the ground he stood on clean, even if he couldn't change what lay deeper. As night fell, the sky turned a deep, endless blue. The stars came out one by one, reflected faintly in the window of the house behind him. The maple's shadow stretched across the yard, long and thin. Michael sat there until the air grew cold again, then stood slowly, his joints stiff, his breath visible in the cooling air. He turned once more to the tree, resting his hand on its trunk. "Rest easy," he murmured, though he wasn't sure whether he meant the man buried beneath or himself. The bark was smooth and cool beneath his fingers, the pulse of life running silent and steady within. When he walked back toward the house, he didn't look back. The bench stood alone in the moonlight, the young tree beside it swaying gently. The wind carried through the branches, whispering softly, almost like a voice, one that spoke not in words, but in the deep language of time and soil, of things buried and remembered. Inside, he turned off the lights and stood by the window, watching the yard dissolve into shadow. The silence felt different now, not empty, but whole. He knew he would stay here until the end, tending to the earth, letting it keep its secrets. There were no more mysteries left to solve, no ghosts to chase. The past had done what it always does. It had settled back into the ground, taking everything with it. And yet, even as the night deepened, Michael thought he could still feel the faint vibration beneath his feet, the slow, patient rhythm of the land. Not the hum of engines or the echo of voices, just the quiet heartbeat of the world continuing on, indifferent and eternal. He closed his eyes and listened. It was the sound of the earth remembering. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There are plenty of more incredible true story mysteries waiting for you on this channel. Go watch the next one right now. And if this video gave you chills, share it with someone who loves a good mystery too.